Hey everybody, my name's Allison Ostrander and I am the Director of Risk Tolerance as well as an options specialist here at Simpler Trading. And in this video, I want to talk about a setup that I have been using this earnings season that has overall been working out pretty well. So for any trade that you hold through earnings, especially if it is shorter dated, I cannot stress enough that you should always look at this as a lotto style trade, meaning that you are okay losing 100% of your capital risk on it, because anything can happen around earnings, whether it happens with the numbers itself, whether it happens with guidance for the future. There's a lot of crazy moves that can happen around the announcement that can be unpredictable. So you should always keep your risk smaller than you normally would, and always be mindful that you could lose 100% of that going into these trade ideas. Now, that being said, there has been one setup that I mentioned that I have been trading through earnings announcements that have been working out pretty well. And so I want to share it with y'all here today, and a few names to keep an eye out for this week. So the setup is basically I have been looking at symbols that overall haven't done well last year, which is quite a few of them, right? But they've started to turn up some into their earnings announcements, or they at least aren't still falling apart into earnings. And then the last cherry on top that I look for, that I need to see before potentially jumping in, is if it has a valid bullish divergent bar going into the announcement. Now, bullish divergent bar, I usually give 3 bars to follow through, which means as long as we have not seen a higher high follow through from the bullish divergent bar that printed prior to the announcement, then there's a good possibility that it could either 1, follow through on the news, or 2, like we've seen a lot of, get some sort of gap to the upside and maybe a follow through higher. So let me share some examples of that we've seen this earnings season, and then we'll look at a few names that have earnings this week to keep an eye out for to see if the setup also occurs there. The first one that was like that was Tesla that I have up here. So you can see right here is a valid bullish divergent bar prior to the announcement that afternoon, and then on the announcement, right, that next trading day, we had a nice gap to the upside. It, of course, followed through with the higher high, and then had a nice follow through on the run into resistance. We also saw this happen on AMD. AMD, of course, did not do so well last year, had 2 valid bullish divergent bars prior to the announcement. Neither of these followed through with higher highs, and this one still had the 3rd bar to try and follow through after the earnings announcement happened, and it did, right? Both of them had a nice gap and follow through with a higher high. We had Netflix, right? Netflix was one of the first ones to release earnings and did hold up a bit better into the end of the year. But of course, with those gaps that it had early on, it still was nowhere near where it was at the start of the year. And then, of course, we had a nice run up into the earnings, valid bullish divergent bar going into the news. And you can see on the second bar there, followed through with the higher high and then had a nice trend to the upside. GILD was one that I ended up playing. This one already had a bit of a good move off of the earnings announcement at the end of last year. But as you can see back here, still struggled quite a bit. And so into the news, I noticed that we had a bullish divergent bar, that it didn't completely fall apart into earnings. It was basically consolidating. So I decided to take that trade idea and at least look to play it into resistance. And that's what I got. It was a great pop into resistance. It allowed for a nice win, especially because I opened it prior to earnings, right? So I'm not opening it the day of the bullish divergent bar. All I'm looking for is to say, hey, is this still valid right before the announcement, whether it happens that afternoon or the next morning. So GILD worked out nicely. FISV was another one that we took in the mastery that had great follow through. So here, for example, bullish divergent bar, right, had a little bit of a run up into earnings, was pretty messy last year overall, right? It wasn't bullish by any means. And then we can see we had a nice gap up, excellent follow through, higher overall for FISV. FTNT was also similar. Bullish divergent bar prior to the announcement, run up into the news, didn't do so hot last year, beautiful gap to the upside. CME is a good example of one where it actually had the valid bullish divergent bar and then excellent follow through here as well to the upside. So, and then of course had held up into earnings, right? Didn't completely fall apart and did not do so well last year. MAS is another one. Now here, this one actually initially off earnings had gapped lower, but because of the bullish divergent bar, there was still that possibility of a follow through on a higher high. And it did, right? It actually bumped up nicely and then is doing a good job of maintaining support here as it continues to move higher. So quite a few names that had this setup going into their announcements that have had excellent follow through. And there's certainly more out there, but those are the ones that I can think of off the top of my head. Pepsi, also bullish divergent bar prior to the news, excellent bounce to the upside. RCL also had a bullish divergent bar prior to the news, a little bit of a run up into it. Obviously didn't do too well last year, and it had excellent follow through. So I'm sure there are more out there that I could find and go through for you guys, but you understand the setup now, right? That something didn't do too well last year, has either run up or held going into earnings. And then most importantly, what I look for is it has a valid bullish divergent bar prior to the news. However, let me be clear, right? This doesn't always happen. Earnings can be a mixed bag of things. For example, Snap had this setup, did not do too well last year, did have, not Snap. I must have been thinking something else. Didn't have a valid bullish divergent bar. I thought it did prior to the announcement, but as you can see, didn't do too well at first, bounced back there. But I know another one was PayPal. PayPal, for example, did not do well. So obviously it was beaten up last year, did have a valid bullish divergent bar into the announcement. And at first, off the numbers, it was actually opening higher after hours for those of you who are watching. But then news came out that the CEO wasn't staying, right? That they're starting a new search. And the market didn't like hearing that. And so ultimately, we ended up opening lower and trading down. This is exactly why you should be mindful of the capital risk you put in. Because even though this is a setup that is following through more often than not this earnings season, it doesn't always mean that's going to be the case. So please, please, please still keep your risk small and be mindful of it. The reason why I'm sharing this setup with you, though, is because overall it has been working. So let's look at a few names that have earnings this week that may or may not see this setup happen on them, right? CORT is one, currently has a bullish divergent bar. Remember, it has to be valid into the news, but this has earnings a little bit later and has had a decent run up into the announcement. Was it kind of a mixed bag last year overall for that one? HLF is another one. Didn't do too well last year, had a run up. Technically, this bullish divergent bar is followed through, but there's still, I think, time until earnings. So we'll see if that ends up making a valid bullish divergent bar for us to consider taking. CRSP is next. So this one currently is making a bullish divergent bar, has earnings coming up, had a run up into earnings, didn't do so hot last year, so might be one to play up into resistance. Zillow is another one where it's on the watch list. It doesn't have a valid bullish divergent bar as of right now, but could still form one prior to the announcement and is certainly setting up in a similar way. SPWR is another one maybe to keep on your watch list this week. Not quite the run up, but it is more consolidating. I would argue it's not falling apart. It's just kind of in a choppy range here going into the news. And it does have that bullish divergent bar, is no stranger to getting gaps around earnings or bigger movements. So that might be one to take a look at on your watch list. Shop, I believe, is another one that has earnings coming up this week. Could potentially have a valid bullish divergent bar, obviously did not do so well last year, and is no stranger to gap moves around earnings. So that's another one to keep on your watch list. And Para might be one to keep an eye on. Also had a nice run up, didn't do too well last year. Currently is trying to make a bullish divergent bar. We'll once again want to see if it remains valid into earnings or if another one prints that's valid into the announcement, but all ones to maybe consider to add to your watch list for this week. Or if you know of any other symbols that have earnings this week, certainly look out for that setup, something that didn't do too well last year, that ideally has either run up or maintained trading in a certain range going into the announcement, meaning it hasn't continued to move lower and fall apart, and has a valid bullish divergent bar going into the news itself. If you see something like that, then it might be worth putting a little bit of capital risk out there to see if you can't follow through with some sort of higher high and some sort of quick win. Thank you so much for joining me, guys. I hope y'all have a great rest of your trading day. As always, may the trade be with you, my fellow Jedis, and I look forward to talking to you next time. Bye. Hey, Allison Ostrander here, Director of Risk Tolerance at Simpler Trading. Thanks for watching the video. If you enjoyed this video, please be sure to like and comment down below to help us out. Also, be sure to subscribe and click the bell icon so you can get notified when we release our next video. And if you want to watch us trade in real time using our own money, go to simplertrading.com to learn how to sign up. As always, may the trade be with you, and we'll see you in the next video. Bye.